Do you remember when Obama was hounded for his birth certificate? Where it's like they said, "Where's the birth certificate? Where's the birth certificate?" They showed the birth certificate. They said, "Where's the long form?" And then it was, "Where's your college records? Where's your high school records? Where's your baby records? I don't even think you were a human being." Like, it was obscene. They were hounding him like for like a year, and I remember when the first black president had to basically cowed into showing this record to show that, yes, I am indeed an American. Meaning his the very nationality was being questioned and under assault, and making him show his birth certificate. They've never done that for anybody else. In fact, you've had politicians like what? Like Ted Cruz, if I'm not mistaken, was Canadian. And nobody says anything about that. And yet, Obama, whatever you want to think of Obama, he is American. Hawaii is a state. You may not like Hawaii. You may feel some kind of way with those, odd ocean people there. But whatever. It is a real, genuine state with real life human beings that have real life concerns that vote for people based on their material interests that chose Obama. Do you remember, if you're African American, how you felt when you saw that? Whites may not get it, but blacks will get it. What did you feel when you saw the first black president gravitas, style? He does the presidential thing well. He has the look of a president. If aliens attacked, that's the look of a guy that you'd want. In reality, I want Bernie Sanders, but that look is perfect. And for him, with all of that gravitas, to basically have to throw it away and take this diminutive position of saying, yes, I'm an American. It's like the indignity of that. There was a humiliation that was thrust upon him by the society itself. And it's not necessarily anything as a black mark against him. It's more so a black mark against society that he has to even say it. It's somewhat of an insecurity thing in and of itself. But he felt he had to show it. And he thought, I thought this was utterly ludicrous. The media ran with it. So here I am, showing my birth certificate. I feel that way about Black Lives Matter. What I mean by that is it's the same motif where a group or person has to remind somebody else, in this case a larger group, that our lives matter. Now, this is not to deprioritize other people's lives. It's not that. And it's not to undermine the value and the worth of anybody else's life. Not at all. It makes the point that all lives are equal. And the reason why it makes the assertion that Black Lives Matter is because there's this understanding, either an insecurity, not to mention a thing where you can see in the outside world where it looks like you could be killed, you could be jailed, anything pretty much can happen to you. You can be shot in your house, meaning you're not even safe in your own home, sleeping. That's what that comes from. There's a deficiency here. I can look around and see that all of these other people's lives are at 100, and my life is at 85 in regards to the way it is valued in society. Black lives matter. And having the virtue to say that, it's a humiliation of sorts. Again, in the same way that Obama had to do that. It's like thrust upon you just by virtue of having to get across to the society that this particular thing is true. Nevertheless, they've done extraordinarily well. And the protests and everything else across the United States, they've gotten a large share of that limelight. I read a post today where somebody asked, what does it mean to defund the police? I kind of want the police, especially if I need to call them for an emergency. And people keep forgetting or just not listening to the term. Defund is not the same thing as abolish. You are not destroying and obliterating the police force. You're basically saying the resources can be used elsewhere. That's a different thing. Ultimately, you have two ways of trying to deal with crime in your society. You can try to figure out what's causing that crime and get rid of it. And the catch here is if you find out that what's causing that crime is poverty, and you have your donors, where 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash, and you have a presidential race that's going to get in like $1 billion for each of the candidates, where's the working man in that equation? Nowhere. So this notion of acknowledging the poverty thing, not going to come up. It's not going to come up. We can't have that conversation. Keep in mind, the only reason that economics came up into the conversation for the last 8 years was because of Sanders. If Sanders wasn't around, that conversation would have never been had. And so that's not something that they necessarily want to talk about. So they would talk about policing. They may say, okay, we're going to do some kind of bullshit program here and there, but ultimately never getting into the root of the issue, because the root of the issue directly affects cash. Jeff Bezos wants his $1 trillion. So that guy has to be homeless. Or that other guy can't get a decent wage. You must understand how obscene this is. I find it to be utterly appalling that a society allows this. There is no justification at all for any of these guys to have $1 billion. You must understand. Say for the moment, they have the best of ideas. Let's say the idea for the secret of life, the elixir of life. And they get a loan from the bank. And they go sit with $1 billion or how much ever they got from the bank. And they just sit there, unable to do anything with it. Because there are no workers in the store. There's nobody buying their products. There's no, roads to their shops. I'm making the point that human beings, us, the public, and everybody else is intrinsically linked to them getting that $1 billion. And it is utterly and entirely impossible for them to get that without the public buying their products, working at their shops, building their roads, being their fire department, being their police department to protect their stores and their profits, air to breathe, education system in order to have a decent and competent workforce. I hope you understand the point that I'm saying. We fund all of this stuff. They are a tiny component, and then they expropriate the wealth. That money should be taxed, and that tax should go back to doing things that is in the best interest of the society, like, Medicare for all, for example. My point in this is that that company does not exist without human beings. And the notion that the guy can pull $1 billion is unfounded. It's unfounded. It's like there's no way that anybody can justify that much cash. I know he can justify it. I'm pretty sure other capitalists will try to justify it, but at the end of the day, they don't exist without us. So the idea that he's going to get $1 billion and his workers are scraping by with 15, obscene, utterly obscene. I want to go into this notion of defund the police. And I want to ask the basic question, do Black lives actually matter? And because I think it goes askew. I think it goes askew. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. So, to be specific, defund the police, it could be $1 less, and that's technically defunding the police. That's not necessarily saying get rid of the police. That is saying, let's say, take some of those profits, or take some, not profits, but take some of the money away from the cops and put it into other services. Now, I am the one who asked the question of whether or not the police are necessary. And I am shocked to some degree that the people who are saying defund the police never asked the basic question of why are the police there, and is it possible that the police are not necessarily a cosmic fixture in society? We take it as a foregone conclusion that cops are intrinsically necessary. Why? Why do you think that? Now, you can say, well, there's always going to be crime, and I would say, why do you think that? Look, people want basically peace and security, not law and order. They will settle for law and order if their peace and security is not something that is available to them. But understand what that means. The entire point of law and order means that there is basically crime, and that the conditions that the people are living under is unsafe. Either from a government that has waving maniacs with guns, where you're going to get these kind of altercations where they're killing people and shooting wildly into crowds and whatnot, or you're going to have a different type of society that's less hectic in this way, where you would need that level of maniac. Human nature, in this case, is water in a jar. And what I mean by that is, many people make proclamations about what human nature is, and they miss a key component to that that's kind of obvious. You cannot talk about human nature without talking about location, meaning people don't exist in a vacuum. You can basically say, this person in a capitalistic system that is chocked full of inequality is X. That's more honest, because that gets to the root of human beings in different systems behave in different ways. A system where people had their health care, they could go to school when they wanted to go to school to the maximum of their abilities. They had a stipend from the government, so poverty was basically eliminated. Social Security was expanded, so when people get older, those people can go basically to, do whatever they want. And retirement had been cut down low, so this notion of having too many people for too many jobs evened out. Like, you had a society that basically looked at your problem and says, what are the problems? How do we fix it? And went about it from that perspective, from human growth, happiness, and human development. And you find your police force basically dwindled to nearly nothing. They didn't have the guns. It was entirely unnecessary. The moment that people could fulfill their abilities and didn't necessarily have debt on their backs, they didn't have that necessarily stress, the poverty was eliminated at that point. So this inequality in some degree had been somewhat shaved off. So it wasn't necessarily this level of violence that there was in societies with other inequalities. You could fix your world. Those are things that you can even do in a capitalistic society. And yet, it's not done. It's not done. Any talk of people, yes, have to include the conditions. What's, the link between poverty and income inequality, and for that matter, violence, is pretty well established. The other link that's well established is the outcomes, meaning the things that happen as a result of having a society that accepts conditions within the context of a part of that society, meaning a permanent underclass of sorts. You have the heartbreaking level of infant death or infant death rates or infant mortality, spike in suicides where the world went down, spike in drug abuse. You have learning deficits due, right. That one is interesting. So kids who grew up in poverty had this kind of learning disability that was associated with it, where the gray matter of the brain basically was less than a kid that was not in poverty. The kid was basically having a psychic understanding of existing in that level of inequality, even if it couldn't necessarily entirely understand it and formulate it into words, but it had a material manifestation to it. It's utterly profound. That in and of itself should be reason to get rid of poverty. You also have issues of malnutrition, which of course is going to inhibit issues of studying. You have defective homes, meaning if you're living in a dilapidated environment, those things affect it. We had one of our neighbors basically didn't have lights, so the kid would have to study basically by candle. Community deprivations, lead in the water. Well, obvious, but that's not just in Flint. When Rahm Emanuel did the test in Chicago and found it, he buried that study. Disease for kids, meaning diseases in a certain communities are exacerbated just based on the environmental conditions that those kids live under, not to mention the health conditions that those kids live under. Also, you must understand that famine conditions or conditions of malnourishment perpetuate themselves in the gene line. Meaning, in 2 and 3 generations, that malnourishment will show up as a weakness in their genetics. The study was done years ago. It was villages, I think, in someplace in Europe. But basically what they found was that a famine showed up as a weakness in the genetic line multiple generations on. Meaning, so whatever we're doing to our kids now, it will present later. Understand what that means for issues of slavery, for example. We forget that that wasn't that long ago. Violence, for example, becomes somewhat endemic. And it's spurred on by issues of social tension created by levels of inequality, where the public fully grasp that their lot is unfairly designated, where somebody else's lot is just magnificently that much higher. It creates a friction in the society, it creates an anger, and it incentivizes to some degree violence, either against the individual, meaning themselves, or against somebody else. That can be with drugs, meaning drugs that are harmful, or for that matter, they could be self-harm, they could be suicide, they could be, these are things, the stresses that we put people under as they try to operate in our society. Look, there's also this issue of rational crime that's incentivized. When a person is in a situation where they are whole, they have access to the things that they need, they can get the education that they want, they can get the health care that they want, they don't have debt on their back in some kind of burdensome way where they can't necessarily deal with it, that person is whole. That person's propensity to do crime, short of something like get pot or get something, I don't know what else the other crime would be, but it's lower because there's a comparative disadvantage in regards to what they can get out of it. Meaning my satisfaction ratio is pretty much already met. So that 2% that I may get from that belies the fact that if I get locked up, I can lose everything. But understand that comparative term changes the moment that you don't have this and you don't have that and you need those things. Hell, you may even see somebody else have those things. You may want those things because other people have those things. And it creates a certain anger that disparity exists. I hope you understand what I mean by that. Like, that's, people forget that, but that's a real thing. And that's a driver of violence. It's a pretty direct link where you have social inequality, violence. It's, I mean, it's amazing we allow this stuff. It's the rational point of crime, meaning crime is a rational act. Your society basically incentivizes people to take those actions that run afoul of the law because they need to take those actions in order to survive. Rational action. It's a gamble of sorts. It's a, probability. What are my chances of getting caught juxtaposed against my need to eat, or my need to get the medicine, or my need to have just basic things in order to exist? We incentivize that. Understand, when people go in front of a judge, the judge wags his finger and says, go get the fuck out of here. Take him to jail. But the judge never honestly evaluates, why are these people, so many, continuously flooding in my jails? They take it as a foregone conclusion that crime would exist. It's lunacy. The link is understood. Like, this is not like magic. You can look this stuff up. And the fact that that link is understood and our society just basically ignores it, it's mind-blowing. But it gets across again, your government is utterly detached from what your society genuinely needs and wants. $18,000 a year. 44% of your population, meaning nearly 50% of your population, lives in utter, desperate poverty. And all of the things that I just told you are negative outcomes from that. What are we to expect in a society where we accept a permanent underclass, where we just know that there are going to be negative outcomes, just statistically, including issues of crime? And the reality of it is, instead of dealing with what I just said, where you say, look, we need to invest in those communities. We need to make sure those communities are thriving. We need to make sure those people are happy, they get the education they need, the healthcare they need. We don't make sure that people are whole. Yes, that's what we're going to do. We're going to deal with that wealth gap between black and whites. That's 10 to 1 because of the issues and legacies of slavery. And then the business interests that they were denied, or the loans that they were denied, or the housing areas that they were denied. And that going all the way up with a certain momentum of racism to the 90s. We're going to fix all that shit. We're going to change America. We're ready. Until you get there, you're going to have difficulties. And we accept it. And so what do? You throw in cops. Cops are not primary. Cops are a reaction to basically a society that has basically abandoned communities and allowed entrenched inequality to basically pervade the system itself. If you dealt with the inequality, the cops will wither away. And by the way, even if they don't go to zero, they wouldn't look like the cops that we have. Do you remember when Django in the movie, Jamie Foxx, he becomes free and he goes and he gets the loudest suit that he can find. And part of the reason he did that, you must understand, it's a deficit, that lack, that not having the things that you need, that second-class citizenship that's somewhat implied just by virtue of the deification of cash, meaning people worship cash. Capitalism is their religion, literally, and they kneel at the altar every time they buy something. You can hate the God, but you're going to worship at that church anyway. And knowing that, flesh to bone knowing that, you grow up knowing how important cash is. Your success is often measured by how much cash you have and not the quality of person an individual is. That's mind-blowing in and of itself, because that's basically you growing up with certain values and your society saying, yeah, those values are bullshit. These are the values that matter. So if you don't have that thing that people love and people say is successful, how do you feel? Place that for the moment. How do you feel when you don't have access to the things that you need? When you need to borrow from this person in order to pay this person off, and then borrow from this person again to pay the other person off. When you have no options out, your decision space is narrowly constrained. Your kid needs $50 for a trip and you don't have it. How do you feel in that situation? And again, at the exact same time, knowing that society judges success by how much cash. Whether you accept that on an intellectual level or not, you know at a gut level, 3 a.m. between you and your God, that's how society measures success. And there's a feedback mechanism when you get more cash and you have the capacity to buy more things, you feel that much more successful in the process. It is a fucked up system. You must understand, not everybody wants or needs to excel. There's some people who just want to live their life, take care of their kids, and do whatever they do. Putter about. Mundane, sublime life. That's not a negative. And that shouldn't necessarily be punished. And whether we realize it or not, it is punished. This idea of meritocracy. And I'm saying this as somebody, I am doing a video and it's almost 12 o'clock. I'm a workaholic. I enjoy what I do. And because I enjoy what I do, I tend to do it a lot. After this, at some point, I'm going to have to do the show in the morning because I'm also doing 2 shows for the short time period. The Political Misfits one is not going to pan out. So I'm going to be taking over Frontlines, the flagship show of Sputnik. Promotion. And a shitty way of getting it. But nevertheless, that's a whole nother conversation. There's a deficit. So the reason that there's a deficit, the reason he gets that loudest suit is because basically your society tells you rich is great. And if you don't have the ends implicitly into that, you're not worthy. And not just implicit into that, you not having the things that you need are basically punished by you going hungry or going without your medication or going without X or Y. That's a fucked up society. I mean, my mom just wanted to live. She didn't want this, all this other stuff. And when she got out of school, she was working. I think they was getting like $7. But going for like 20, 30 years, she ends up with like $13 when she retires. That's like nothing. I mean, she fits for the majority of her life into the $18,000 and under box. And yet she has to raise a kid. The kid ends up getting sick, having to keep going for medical stuff. She ends up getting sick at the exact same time. The window of disaster is narrow. The least funds that you have. And what we do to people in this society, it's just shocking to me, honestly. I mean, if your objective is to have fulfilled, developed, prospering, smart human beings, you can do that. Jeff Bezos won't get $1 trillion, but you can do that. Your government, believe it or not, makes dollars. They're not real. It is a weird thing for a product that is not real, that is just conjured, and have people go hungry on the streets. That is just unacceptable from the standpoint of a rational society. And yet, here we are. People hungry on the streets who need cash. Cash not being real, a legal fiction of sorts, and a mystical process creates those dollars. So the government has pretty much any supply of those dollars that he wants. Hell, Trump could go and say, "Give me $1 trillion penny," and they could put that penny, that coin, and he could pull out, and he could say, "All right, I'm going to give this to the homeless population. We're going to get rid of homelessness." He could do that. There wouldn't be any inflation because basically you're just pulling away from you're just pulling money from that sort. It's not you're not overburdening the supply chain in that situation where you would create a situation of inflation. It's a side thought. I guess my point is, when he's wearing that, he's displaying a deficit. Meaning, what he was dealing with from the standpoint of slavery and from the standpoint of being a second-class citizen, from the standpoint of not having anything, not having the ability to make his needs met and everything else, and then to immediately transition, well, he's still that person. When I was 260 pounds, when I lost the weight a year later, I was still that fat kid. My brain functioned in the exact same way. So his response to that is to basically push back with almost a proportion in the opposite direction in order to compensate. The bright suit is a compensation for the deficit that he has within himself. He's trying to externalize a solution to balancing that out. Hence, that peacock. People laughed when he did that. But that's trauma. Experiential trauma being basically shown in the suit that he's wearing. It damages him. It damages human beings. I told you about the brain matter, that it fucks up. It is appalling that we allow this as a society. I've said nothing about race. It is appalling we allow this as a society. And yes, there should be reparations. The 10-to-1 gap is obscene. That number hasn't gone anywhere. You have a large number of people who are in poverty. You have a large number of people who are about to get kicked out of their homes. Blacks have been dying 3-to-1. Those numbers are entirely because of a health disparity, a housing disparity, an economic disparity that's allowed and to propagate. Let's stop pretending that actions and decisions that are made back 100 years ago don't somehow affect what we're doing today. I mean, for fuck's sake, the New Deal was put into place. The Democratic Party still pretends as if they're FDR type Democrats. And just so we're clear, the U.S. government was the one that instantiated slavery. The U.S. government is still around today. It was able to beat back the mongrels who wanted to basically have the freedom to enslave somebody else. My point is, whether or not any particular vampire is still around where black people can line up in a very long line into the tune of millions, and each one just stands and hits him in the stomach and then takes a nickel out of his pocket, and somehow he's been magically spelled to create nickels over there. I don't need that to take place. The government itself was in existence. The government itself created those laws that basically said this black body is a commodity, but it's a commodity that he or her can never access. It can only be accessed by a white person. And that basically became the law for hundreds of years. But that was the government that did that. That was the government that made that choice. The government that is still around today. It was able to accept the tax revenue from all of that labor. It was able to grow and expand as a powerhouse, getting free and cheap labor under those terms. And in doing all of that for all of those hundreds of years, there was never any compensation for you. You guys are free slaves. Get the fuck out. In which case, many of those people were still stuck on the plantations, not able to read, write, and having to make do. The fact that we are still here, man, is an amazing testament. And then you have Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was basically rolled back with a backlash. Equal and opposite force, right? The thing is, the force is not always equal and opposite. You have sometimes where the force is dependent upon the strength of the two armies. It's like if you said, well, the Iraqi army was going to hit back. Well, the Iraqi army didn't have the capacity to basically fight the American army in those terms. Well, during Reconstruction, it was too strong in the sense of we're still in the South. These guys are still basically Klansmen and Nazis and fascists. And yeah, they still hate blacks. There we are. Riding these kamikaze attacks is not the same thing. Yeah, that's not the same thing. All right. So yeah, that's trauma shown. I guess. Oh, I know what I was saying. That this stuff goes back centuries. I mean, then you get redlining. You get the situation where you can't live in but certain communities. You can't get but certain jobs. You are not going to get those loans in the bank. No, the New Deal is not going to apply to you because that's the only way we're going to get the New Deal passed. I mean, like brutal policies. And think about what that means when you're talking about successive generations. You've ensconced people to basically force them to live in ghettos, or for that matter, to live in neighborhoods that are impoverished. That was a choice. That was a policy choice. I'm just always enamored by whites who were like, yeah, man, but that was like 10 years ago. You need to get over that shit. Yeah. Truth of the matter is, that stuff has a certain momentum to it, and one generation bears the scars of basically the last generation that came before it. In the same way that I told you that the famine or the malnourishment in one generation appears in later generations, where clearly the amount of wealth that a generation or that a family has shows later on, meaning poor families are more likely to have poor kids who end up being poor. These are things that are known links. We accept. Do Black Lives Matter? And if they do in earnest, are you being too diminutive with the defund the police thing? Don't misunderstand me. I understand the metrics of defund the police. We want to defund the police. We want to put that money into social services and other things to make the police less relevant and less maniac. And we also want to put certain policies in place to ensure that the police don't act like maniacs. I don't know how you put policies in place to stop police from acting like maniacs. They're trained to act like maniacs. When Rashawn Brooks was killed, it was intentional. That's how they're trained. Yeah, that's how they're trained. I guess my point is an honest assessment. Just being honest. You could see a 10-to-1 ratio gap in white versus black wealth. It's not magic. Wealth builds on itself. And up until like the 80s and the 90s, you basically had African Americans barred out of these other aspects of society in a general sense. Even affirmative action went mostly to white women. And so it becomes like you've created a permanent underclass that you never want to talk about. And you never want to talk about it because, A, you don't want to get blamed in one sense, meaning whites don't want to be blamed. They don't want to have that conversation. And B, they think it's taking money out of their pocket in some way. At least that's my guess. White folks are not to blame. At least not the ones that are alive. You do, however, reap the benefits of previous exploitation or exploits. By definition, you reap the benefits. The Native Americans are not here. You are here. Your very existence, to some degree, is a benefit to the murder and slaughter and the enslavement of African Americans. The ability to be able to float through society without necessarily being killed 3-to-1 is a privilege, not getting the benefit of the doubt in the criminal justice system. That's a privilege. Whether you're in poverty or not. There are certain privileges that go and extend beyond the notion of whether you're just dirt poor like everybody else. Yes, I understand poverty sucks, and poverty sucks for all of us. But to be honest, whether you are specifically in poverty is secondary to the fact that white wealth is 10 to 1. I mean, on average, you have something like 176,000 to 18,000. That number is abysmal. Certainly, in that situation, you can see how, okay, there's a debt that is owed for just vicious atrocities that were committed. And we never actually owned up and rectified that honestly, which creates tensions and hostilities in our society. Yes, some African Americans are doing well, and yes, a smattering are rich. But the smattering, a few, is not the point. I'm talking about the majority or the whole. It needs to be rectified, that's all. Like, until that's fixed, you're going to create a certain degree of hostility and violence in your society, not to mention you're creating a permanent underclass. And that permanent underclass, white, black, everything in between, it incentivizes certain behaviors and outcomes. We either accept those outcomes or we do something about those communities, and we pull those communities and ensure those communities are thriving. That's what you mean by defund the police. That basically, you can deal with crime in two ways. If you know that this area has 3 to 1 crime as opposed to another area, and you know that the main quality is that dirt poor, make sure it's not dirt poor. It would magically appear in the other column. Right? On average, yes. I think you can, for the most part, narrow down crime. Whatever's left over, you do. So, I also want to get into the point that is trauma, by the way. When Django is acting that way, that is expressing trauma. African Americans do the same thing. The peacocking, the hyper masculinity in rap and whatnot. This is basically insecurity posing as bravado. But again, that stuff is vestiges of things that soaks in our society. It will be unreasonable to believe that something that was stoked for 300-400 years will be up in a flash. Either from this mystical spell that society was put under that had this idea that this person is less than a man in some way. And being so brash and so full of arrogance and bravado that you even enshrine the shit into law, something that is not real at all. And show how ridiculous and phony law is, blacks are not 3/5 of a human being. If law was a real thing, it would at least have been able to get that right. Also, stress. We always underestimate stress. Like, think about how much stress is on a family when the person doesn't know how they're going to get the next meal or how they're going to pay the rent. You have 44 million people who are out of a job right now. And with all those people who are out of a job, you're going to get a lot of people who are going to get kicked out of their house next month when all of the services and everything else just stop. What are you going to do when the money runs out? That's stress. This is what we allow in our society. This is what we do to our kids as they soak up the angst from their parents. Why do we allow this? Why should we allow this? Would a rational society allow this? And then the secondary question after that is, how do we change it? But this gets to my point of cops aren't primary. We shouldn't assume that cops are necessary in a society. We can assume that they're necessary in a capitalistic society, not a society proper. Look, we are poor decision space, diligent workers. Right. Yeah, yeah. If the private sector can't basically do their job, private sector shouldn't have, be able to do in and of themselves. The government should be able to step in and do the job. But again, this is a rational society thing, not necessarily a thing of, not a thing of good ideas. If I had to make one suggestion to Black Lives Matter, humbly, you're at an inflection point. I've never seen, in my 42 years on this planet, the public turn its attention and say, what is this black thing? Typically, whites, not a conversation they want to get into. And yet, right now, they are. And not just they are, they agree with you, meaning Black Lives Matter, which is a change of like 20 something points. They bought your argument that the cops are biased against a particular community, particularly African Americans. And this is, by the way, where you had years of data on this stuff, that they was, the data didn't matter. Seeing a black man choked to death after 9 grueling minutes, that's visceral. And regardless of what the data shows, that's visceral. That digs into you in a way that's heart-wrenching to watch. And for America had to reconcile, oh my God, this is what cops have been doing. This is kind of like the Rodney King beating. Oh my God, I didn't know that they were doing that. Well, here you are. It legitimizes everything that Black Lives Matter has been saying for all of these years. And now they are getting a certain degree of limelight and a credit and approval, which is the interesting part. The public changed its mind on a host of issues all at once. And they changed its mind on a host of issues all at once. There's this immediate shift where it seems like some members of the public can't deal with it and have started these kamikaze missions riding their cars into crowds. You will see more of that. And at some point, somebody's going to get killed from doing that, maybe more so as they try to outdo one another in regards to this kind of serenade to Charlottesville. That's sad and unfortunate that those people will be in that particular situation, that frame of mind, that they're so racist and so fucked up, so out of touch with absolute reality, that they are willing to basically kill either themselves or somebody else for white pride. Fucking idiots. Yeah, fucking idiots. If I had to give you one piece of advice, just one. Class. I understand that the defund the police thing, and by the way, that's starting to take off. That argument is starting to kind of gain ground and gain an entrenched position where media is starting to engage it honestly and favorably. But if Black lives do matter, then all of those negative outcomes that I read, where you have blacks that are uniquely in a vulnerable position in this society, either in the sense of housing, either in the sense of salaries, and amount of money in the bank, one emergency or one ticket away from an emergency, those type of things. If you care about blacks, meaning Black Lives Matter, there's a list of outcomes that are utterly atrocious and abysmal. Everything from health to education to goddamn brain matter. I think this is the issue. Don't misunderstand me. Going after the cops, yes, defund the police, and that, like I said, just gained traction. But society is at a weird point, right? Because it's an odd thing of saying, okay, yeah, police are doing some fucked up stuff. And every video that you've seen of police beating up a protester legitimizes the entire reason for those people being out there. But it's also, it's like, it's accepting Black Lives Matter almost as a separate thing into itself. So it's like, yes, it's policing, but it's policing almost within the context of blacks. And so it becomes like, so wait, are you, is it the public focus on the black thing or the cop thing or the intersection of the two? Like, it's a messy thing to me where I'm unclear on what the entire topic is. The only thing I will point out is that poverty is the linchpin. Like I said, if your objective is to get rid of cops and you get rid of organically, eliminate the reason for the cops to be there. The rich have basically took a ton of cash, they hoard that cash, and they throw in cops, or they pay politicians to hire cops in order to police the society to keep those people from going to get that cash. And so we put 25% of the world's population in our jails. China has 3 times our population, does not have that many people in their jails. That number is appalling. And yet, here we are. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, I'll in this. I mean, I guess the only basic point that I'm trying to make is if Black lives do indeed matter, which I would indubitably say they do, there are a litany of negative outcomes that can be addressed almost entirely with the issues of poverty. Make sure people get Medicare for all, ensure people have expansion Social Security so when they get older, they can work to retire with dignity as opposed to being desperate and not being able to get their ends meet. There are things, basic, straightforward policy positions that you guys can take in order to alleviate many of the heavier items that people deal with, especially people of color in our society. And again, I would even say reparations, especially if the public has turned its attention and say, what's this black thing, which is kind of what it feels like is taking place. Maybe that's a jump with the shark. But if indeed the question is, what's this black thing, then in part and parcel to that is compensation for labor rendered. And keep in mind, I was dragged to this position. Not dragged is too strong, but Bob wore at me on this position. Because the catch is, I agreed with reparations. What I didn't agree with was running it in a political space. It's radioactive to run that in a political space under normal circumstances. But now, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I would say this though. BLM has been able to get a huge amount of positive press. Fucking A. That needs to be converted into a political space. Don't flame out like Occupy Wall Street. There has to be some kind of brain trust that gets all of these people organizing in some kind of way. So when they're out there marching, it's not just a march and then go home, kind of like the Pussycat stuff. Beyond that point, I really do think a broadside on the issues of poverty, whether it's reparations or whether it's just a broadside of saying, look, let's just get rid of poverty as a whole thing that needs to be our national sense of pride. The other generations got rid of slavery. That other generations won the war. This other generation had workers' rights and women's rights. Our generation is going to be human rights. We're going to get rid of poverty. That's emancipatory. I mean, Sanders, I guess, ended up several months too late, but that is an emancipatory argument. And coming up in a few months, I strongly suspect you'll be making it. What you're going to find, let me say it this way, and this video is going way too long, so fuck it. Well, let me say how I feel about it. I always ask people, how do they feel about the protests and everything else? And, you know, it's an interview show, so. if one of the things that I was heartened by, it's funny, my brain is starting to fog up. I've been up for, my wife reminded me I haven't been to bed yet for the last 2 days. My body's starting to conk out. When one of the things that that I was heartened by over the last several months with the protests was that they were white, black, gay, straight, trans. It ran across the board. Everybody, all parts of society, threw themselves into the streets. Now, the interesting part here is that I think part and parcel to that, and the reason for that, is that Sanders screamed into a mic, are you willing to fight for somebody in the way that you're willing to fight for yourself? And every last person across the United States that had a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker screamed out, yes! Now, they screamed out yes because that reaches into the core of the way they believe society should be run. Empathetic, cooperative. We can do better things together than we can ripping ourselves apart. In fact, the universe has a bias towards love in this way. Love, innocence, and cooperation. The only things can be built are together. But they scream. We all scream. Yes! You want Medicare for all? They all scream. Yes! You want Social Security? Yes! Wealth tax? Yes! Green New Deal? Yes! You had to say hello. You had to say hello. Now, to back that up, polling showed Sanders won on all of those issues. When the public says, or they ask, who do you like for the environment? Sanders. Who do you like for the economy? Sanders. Who do you think cares about you? Sanders. Who do you think is more electable? Joe Biden. By like 30-40%. And so the election boiled down to that argument of electability, which wasn't an area where Sanders was willing to fight on. He never even brought it up. But this might be the revenge of Sanders in this case. Because when those people saw that the Democratic Party was willing to tank it to Trump in order to stop Sanders, and they know that the party cheated last year in 2016, they saw what happened in Iowa in 2020 with their own eyes in real time as they basically gave Pete a ton of coverage, then fed into Pete to make it look like he was winning at the exact same time Pete went on stage for that debate. So he was able to tell the American public that, yeah, I won, that's great. They cheated. Real time. Cheated. Public can see it. So Sanders didn't have that fight. But that argument, are you willing to fight for somebody? But the public realized they were willing to tank it all in order to stop Sanders, even if that meant losing to Trump. What did Chris Matthews say? Yeah, maybe this time around, they might need to just kind of lose it to Trump. Why? Because they understood that if Sanders took it, he took it for a generation. Their issue wasn't that Sanders was going to lose. Their issue was that they thought Sanders was going to win. And the Democratic Party was going to be fundamentally changed at the very least for a generation. They were going to have to crawl back out of their ditches just like they had to do back during the FDR era. And to be honest, Sanders was so weak that that might not be true. The thing is, those people realize two very important things. That when they're hounded by you have nowhere else to go, that the Democratic Party doesn't care about that, meaning the upper echelon. They were willing to go somewhere else. Each and every one of them was willing to go to a broker convention if it meant stopping Sanders. That means they each were all, everyone, man and woman, raised their hand, willing to lose in the end, because there is no Sanders supporter that would ever vote for a Democrat under those terms. If you're going to rip it away from the guy, you're not going to get this vote. Beyond that point, they also realize something else that's a little bit more sublime, but just as powerful. Those policies were popular. When you see Medicare for all gets 88% Democrats. You think this argument is over. We've had this fight. We've won this fight. When you see Social Security expansion gets like 70% support, we've won this fight. When you see a Green New Deal has whatever, that's what, you won this fight. Wealth tax, won that fight. Economic, won that fight. When you realize you've won all of those fights on issues of policy, but they chose him over some intangible quality that doesn't entirely exist. Rage. Frustration. A man is murdered. Are you willing to fight for somebody like you're willing to fight for yourself? And those people say, yeah, and they threw themselves into the streets. Many of those people were supplanting the rage that they were experiencing with an intransigent political system that does not care one iota about what they want in real terms, especially in material terms. And so they threw their bodies into the streets. Where else were they going to go? And they let rage and indignation roam free as the mob of the unjust or the mob of the mistreated basically go through and ravage the cities. Now, again, it's the injustice that provoked the action in this case, not the other way around. But everybody was out there. And I felt so good about that because this wasn't like just a black protest. You had white Iowa, every last person there white, holding up a sign that said, trust black people. Like, that's mind-blowing. And then you had the larger public saying, we agree. 80-something percent. Carry on. We agree. That's mind-blowing. Like, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, typically, whites acted like the cops were perfectly right, always honest. The cops wouldn't do that. They give this presumption of innocence or presumption of truthfulness, which is just insane. But that was the way the cops worked. And that's the way our society kind of clockworked. And so all this stuff has changed. Now, the question is, how long does it last? The younger generation is hostile towards cops. So that one, what's coming behind the older generation is going to be rough. But if this generation gets to the point of saying, yeah, we're not buying that cop stuff, that's astonishing. It just really is. We're in the middle of a sea change. And being here like this, it's awkward, it's strange, it's uneasy in the sense of where it's going. Each of us, to some degree, want it to go somewhere. But the fact that it's there at all is kind of like heartwarming. And the fact that all of these people, white, black, gay, straight, all of them saw it as an issue for them to join in on. Fucking hard by that. Here's the catch. We also have to follow suit. Understand what I've just said. If a white person is shot by a cop, we should also follow suit. If a gay person is shot by a cop, we should also follow suit. If they and all of these people are willing to come out for an African American male that's shot, and basically a black issue under normal circumstances, then we are to some degree loyalty bound to do the exact same thing for them. And maybe I'll make a separate video on this just to make sure that's a thing unto itself. But I think that's something that needs to be understood, especially if we're talking about solidarity. If you have a large situation where people start coming out for each other in the way that they would come out for themselves, that would vindicate the way Sanders ran this race, because it would do something that supersedes what Sanders could do in and of himself, even though it did it in a kind of ass-backwards way. Like, share, and subscribe. Let's see. Xavier Foster. How are Chaz working out? So it's interesting, right? I haven't been following entirely the Chaz thing. I've been seeing just kind of out the side of my eye. and we covered it on the show once. Republicans have been freaking out over the Chaz, this kind of autonomous zone. You can understand why. From their standpoint, Republicans are law and order, and this seems like it's just this disorderly thing. Not to mention, if it becomes anarchist, they're really going to hate it because, for obvious reasons, not anarchist citizens of chaos, but anarchist citizens of like socialists, independent socialists, or libertarian socialists, that type of stuff. But I can't speak on it competently. I've seen them do it. I've seen them try to hold off. I've seen them try to set the rules. I've seen the governors and the town officials basically give them a pass on it. But I don't know what's going on inside. Best I can say. Wesley Walker, with the amount of money they gave to the wealthy class in those 4 bills, yes, every citizen could have been given $250,000 easy. Think about that, what that would have done. I know. Yes, Wesley. With one caveat. You can't change people overnight with cash. Like, in fact, some of those people may even lose that cash. Like, not necessarily knowing how to deal with it. Again, the Django paradox. The moment that you get a situation where the person is transformed immediately, there's no measure. There's no familiarity with the new state. And so what's being expressed is basically trauma being, trying to work itself up, where you have this one aspect of self that went so long with a deficit that now that you have your identity that you can kind of set for yourself, you decide to shape and take on an identity that pushes back against that deficit. It's almost like a proportion to try to balance out the amount. It's like I have a -3, so I'm going to put +3 in order to balance that out. That's the way I see it. But that's, like I said, it's trauma. Yeah, but that doesn't change overnight, Wesley. That's kind of my point. Like, even if you gave somebody $1 million to every person that was in, I don't know, the ghetto and poor and whatever else, that doesn't change them overnight. Like, there's no measure in that sense. Like, it's one thing if back in the 60s or back in the 50s, the government says, okay, we're going to give you this money for reparations, and we're going to ensure that you can have the businesses and the schools and et cetera, et cetera. Hell, we're going to even cover your health care and your education expenses going into the next 50, 60, 70 years. We're sorry. Deeply, deeply sorry. If they would have did that back then, it would be a different world now. Honestly. But the catch is, if you did it back then, it would have been no way to immediately change those people back then either. Like, their situation is still their situation. It's something that they would have basically grown into as they expanded. And the gap at that point was able to even out just because of the advantages that African Americans would have been given. But yeah, it would have helped, to put it mildly. I mean, instead they just gave it to the upper class. They raided the place. Charles Cavan, help me with presidential campaign, just turned 35. All right. If you're going to run in the presidential campaign, you got to get on the debate stage. So you got to do something wild and outlandish. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe taking a dump on the White House lawn. That might just get you arrested, and that's kind of gross. I need to know that your campaign has some ability to try to get elected if I'm going to give my talents, because my campaign talents are profound. I used to run campaigns, and then I became infamous, and so I took on an alias, and I've just kind of, at the time I was named Buck Naked, the campaign guy, sleazy and salacious, but I got the job done. No, I'm teasing. I'm fucking around. That's not true. That's not true. Don't tell anybody that. And let's see, there's one more. And I'm going to end this because I do have one more video I want to do. Gary Curtis. Cornel West is the one to pull us all together, to unify and to focus on the movement. You know, that is the catch. And this is kind of why I say the Black Lives Matter thing. I've been seeing what looks like a budding consciousness of class. And I was watching, because I look at the interviews that these guys be having, like outside and everything else. And there does seem to be a class consciousness that's developing. I mean, even in the context of taking the money from the cops and giving it to the other side. Well, that is trying to alleviate some of the class irregularities. If whites, on average, have $176,000 to blacks $18,000, and keep in mind most didn't have anything, and so that's just this kind of average thing. Disproportionately, we lost our jobs. Disproportionately, we will be kicked out of our homes. Understand, though, that the reason that that disproportionate number exists is directly attributable to what came before, and the fact that those people's parents were in maybe a property that was impoverished, increasing their likelihood of also being in an area that's impoverished. You also must understand that poverty shrinks your imagination to some degree. Like, your ability to believe of what you can do is somehow shaped and constrained by what you've seen and what you've experienced, what's familiar to you. This is the same thing with the Sanders issue. Sanders, who's saying, I want Medicare for all, I want to do this and that, despite it having 88% support, the public was like, oh man, I don't know if we can sell that to the rest of the public. You could have. You were backing it by 88%. They were backing it by 70%. But they were going with, okay, we think Joe Biden is more electable because we think Joe Biden is more electable. A ham sandwich at this point will be more electable than Donald Trump. Joe Biden basically is just in his basement all the time, so at this point, there's not that much of a difference, is there? Cornel West is awesome, by the way. Like, share, and subscribe.